Just after midnight on December 18th, 1953, Bonnie Heddy took her final breath in the gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary. While sitting on death row, she wrote, "My case was loving not wisely, but too well. I wanted so much for him to be happy." 7 months earlier, she met Carl Hall in a bar in St. Louis, Missouri, and their story soon became one of two people who collided at the bottoms of downward spirals. Bonnie knew of Carl before their meeting and was intrigued by his bad boy crook reputation. Carl had just been paroled from prison, and Bonnie sought him out. Carl exuded danger and charm, qualities which Bonnie found irresistible. Their connection was immediate, all-consuming, and toxic. To say Bonnie was infatuated with Carl was an understatement, and only days after their meeting, she allowed Carl to move into her house. The pair bonded over similar upbringings. They grew up privileged, and they each had a wild side. Carl was from Pleasanton, Kansas, and he was the child of a successful attorney. When his brother died young, Carl became the center of his parents' universe. They showered him with wealth, but his father was incredibly strict, and Carl began to rebel early in life. Teachers described him as lazy, dishonest, and unmotivated. His ambition extended only to dodging responsibility. "I'll never have to work for a living," he'd say proudly, as he believed his family's money would always shield him from real life and consequences. Around 11 years old, his mother started employing tactics to instill order, but they all failed. In the early 1930s, Carl's mother sent him to the prestigious Kemper Military School. He excelled at first and became an honor student, but his old defiant nature resurfaced around his third year, and the only hope for rehabilitation was the actual military. Carl enlisted in the Marines, but that also failed spectacularly. Carl abandoned his post, went AWOL, and was discharged. He was known to say he'd rather be in jail than in the Marines, and his wish soon came true. Carl's parents passed away relatively young. When his father died in 1946, Carl inherited the family farm and $200,000, which would be more than $3 million today. Now, with a pile of money and no sources of stability, he indulged his reckless side. He sold the family farm, and his fortune quickly evaporated in a haze of failed business ventures, gambling debts, drugs, and booze. Within 5 years, Carl was married, divorced, broke, and deep in the throes of addiction. He resorted to robbing taxi drivers to fund his cravings, and that was how he landed in prison in 1951. Shortly after he walked out 16 months later, he met Bonnie. Bonnie Brown's life, though quieter, followed its own tragic path. She was 7 years older than Carl and grew up on a farm in Missouri. She was primarily raised by her aunt after the untimely death of her mother. Bonnie grew up a kind-hearted and happy kid. In 1935, at 23 years old, she married a livestock merchant named Vernon Heddy. They had a stable relationship for more than a decade, but then the marriage slowly disintegrated and ended in divorce after 17 years. At 40 years old, Bonnie's life took a major turn. 3 years earlier, she had inherited $44,000, the equivalent of nearly $600,000 today, and her family's 360-acre farm in Missouri when her father died. In 1952, she was newly divorced and had a lot of money. She started going to wild parties, drinking heavily, and getting involved in unhealthy relationships, one of which led her into prostitution. A year later, Carl Hall walked out of prison and almost immediately started a relationship with Bonnie. By that time, she was exclusively interested in dangerous men who were outlaw types, and Carl Hall fit the bill. She'd heard of him, and it took virtually no time at all for her to fall under his spell. Within 2 days, they were living together. Within 5 months, they were kidnapping the son of a wealthy car dealer and asking for the equivalent of $8 million in today's money. From Black Barrel Media, this is Infamous America. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer. And this season, we're telling stories of some of the most notorious kidnappings in American history, the crazy events which surrounded each abduction, and the chaotic investigations of the cases. This is episode 6, Bobby Greenlease, No Remorse. Carl Hall had once lived the good life, and he was determined to regain his riches, but without the hard work. His quiet days in prison, where he was serving time for robbing taxis, gave him ample opportunity to craft a plan. Hall remembered a boy he'd met in military school, Paul Greenlease, who spoke of his wealthy adoptive father. In prison, Carl began researching Paul's family, and he soon learned that Robert Greenlease Sr., the adoptive father, was one of Kansas City's wealthiest men. Robert Sr. was known for his Cadillac dealership empire and his lavish charitable contributions. Carl also discovered Robert Sr. had 2 children who were much younger than Paul. When Carl walked out of prison less than a year and a half into his 5-year sentence, his one driving thought was to enact the plot that he had dreamed about in his cell. He needed an accomplice, and as fate would have it, he quickly found Bonnie. Just 2 days after meeting her, Carl moved into Bonnie's house, and it wasn't long before he charmed her into becoming more than just a companion. She became his willing partner in crime. Bonnie was captivated by Carl. For her, this was a chance at the thrilling kind of love she had always longed for. Carl manipulated her devotion to advance his plans. Bonnie's fascination with outlaws and Carl's desperate pursuit of fast money blended perfectly into a partnership headed for tragedy. Over cheap whiskey and cigarettes, Carl laid out his idea to Bonnie to kidnap Robert Greenlease Jr., the 6-year-old son of the millionaire Cadillac salesman. Carl and Bonnie would demand a $600,000 ransom. At the time, $600,000 would have been the largest ransom ever paid in America, and today that figure would be more than $7 million. Bonnie was eager to please Carl, and she was all in. Bonnie threw herself into the plan, and the first major step was to stalk and research the Greenlease family. Robert Greenlease Sr., Bobby's father, embodied the American dream. He was born in 1882 on a modest Missouri farm, and his knack for business became evident at a young age. By his early 20s, he had designed an automobile prototype called the Kansas City Hummer. While the car failed to take off, it marked the beginning of his career. He pivoted into running an auto repair shop and later acquired Kansas City's first Cadillac dealership. Over the years, Robert built an automobile empire. He eventually held wholesale distribution rights and amassed significant shares in General Motors stock, which cemented his wealth. But despite his professional success, Robert's personal life had its share of challenges. He married young and adopted a son, Paul Greenlease, in 1917. In the early 1930s, Paul attended Kemper Military School, where he crossed paths with Carl Hall. Shortly afterward, Robert Greenlease divorced his first wife. He remarried to Virginia Pollock in 1939, and they had 2 children, a daughter, Virginia Sue, and then 4 years later, a son, Robert Jr., known as Bobby. Robert Sr. was 65 years old when Bobby was born, and the family showered Virginia and Bobby with attention and all the material comforts which came with extreme wealth. The Greenlease home was a Tudor-style mansion in the Mission Hills neighborhood of Kansas City, and it was staffed by a small army of maids, nannies, gardeners, and chauffeurs who ensured every detail of daily life was seamless. Despite the luxuries, Robert Sr. took a personal, hands-on approach to Bobby's upbringing, and Robert insisted on personally driving Bobby to the Notre Dame Catholic school in the mornings. And unbeknownst to Robert Sr. or Bobby, their morning routine was being watched. Carl and Bonnie regularly drove past the Greenlease mansion to scope it out. Carl had dreamed about extorting money from the Greenlease family while he was in prison, when his mind wandered back to his time at Kemper Military School with the rich kid, Paul Greenlease. Now Carl decided he and Bonnie should kidnap, 6-year-old Bobby and hold him for ransom. Carl believed the best place to grab the boy was at his school. But then school let out for the summer, and Carl and Bonnie had to decide if they should use another plan. The family's summer schedule was more unpredictable, and at one point, Carl brazenly called the family's house. The maid informed him the family was traveling for the summer in Europe, and they would be back in September. The execution of any plan was now on hold until September, and Carl used the extra time to continue plotting and to purchase all the supplies they needed to pull off the crime. And during that time, the key to the plan became Bonnie. Carl and Bonnie lived at Bonnie's house on her family's farm in Missouri. When they weren't taking trips to Kansas City to stalk the Greenlease family or to get drunk in the bars, they planned the kidnapping. Bonnie was anxious to play a role in a scheme that would make Carl rich again, which she knew in turn would make him happy. Carl's idea put Bonnie on the front lines of the abduction, and she wasn't going to let him down. She immersed herself in amateur theatrics, and she crafted the persona she would need for the kidnapping at the school. She was going to play a character, and she only had a few weeks to practice. When the Greenlease family returned from vacation, Carl ramped up the surveillance. He continuously followed Robert Sr. to Bobby's school and watched the boy walk into the building in the morning. In short order, Carl knew the routine by heart, and he and Bonnie put the plan into motion. On the morning of September 28, 1953, Bonnie learned if the rehearsing would pay off. She called a taxi and asked the driver to take her to the Notre Dame Catholic school. She was dressed in motherly attire with a long skirt, white gloves, a beige blouse, and a brown hat. At 10:55 a.m., the taxi dropped her at the school's front entrance. She asked the driver to wait while she walked inside to deliver her command performance. Bonnie appeared visibly distraught as she entered the school. A nun, Sister Morand, greeted her, and Bonnie laid it on thick. With tears in her eyes and a trembling voice, she fed Sister Morand a believable lie. She claimed to be Bobby Greenlease's aunt, and she needed to take him out of school. Bonnie explained that Bobby's mother, her sister, had suffered a heart attack and was in St. Mary's Hospital. Apologizing profusely for her disheveled state, Bonnie exuded urgency and concern, and she sold her role flawlessly. Sister Morand bought the deception and didn't think to verify the story as she rushed off to fetch Bobby. Bobby was a happy, talkative kid whose wealthy lifestyle gave him no reason to distrust adults. When Sister Morand passed him off to Bobby, Bobby showed no discomfort. He took Bonnie's hand and calmly followed her outside to the taxicab. Bonnie directed the cab driver to drive the pair to a predetermined meeting spot where Carl waited with his station wagon. When the cab dropped off Bonnie and Bobby, Bobby climbed into the back of Carl's car, and he was immediately excited to see the dog that Carl had brought with him for exactly that purpose. Bobby chatted about his own family's pets, and he showed no sign of alarm. Carl and Bonnie engaged with Bobby and asked him about the Jerusalem Cross medal that he wore every day and listened to his stories. As they drove away, the boys' chatter filled the car in what seemed like the light-hearted beginning of an unusual and unexpected adventure. But back at the school, Sister Morand was replaying the encounter in her mind and growing increasingly concerned. While initially dismissing Bonnie's agitation as natural under the circumstances, the sister became uneasy. An odd detail stuck in the sister's memory. Bonnie had smelled like Clarette's chewing gum. The smell was so heavy that it was as if the woman had chomped an entire pack of it. Sister Morand took the issue to Sister Martha Ann, who decided to contact the Greenlease family to verify Bonnie's claims. The sister assumed one of the household staff would answer the phone, but Virginia Greenlease, Bobby's mother, said hello. According to Bonnie's story, Virginia was supposed to be fighting for her life in St. Mary's Hospital, so Virginia's voice immediately set off alarm bells for the nuns. Virginia confirmed that she had not suffered a heart attack. She did not have a sister named Bonnie, and no one was authorized to pick up Bobby that morning. If Bobby was not in school, then Virginia knew nothing of her son's current whereabouts. In a matter of seconds, she went from confusion to full-throttle panic. The Greenlease family notified the Kansas City police as fast as possible, and the case rapidly escalated to the FBI. Investigators interviewed the school faculty and the taxi driver. The taxi driver confirmed Bonnie's description and said he took her and the boy to meet another man. At that point, Bonnie and the boy climbed into the man's station wagon. All clues pointed toward one conclusion: Bobby Greenlease had been kidnapped. Within hours, the theory was confirmed when the family received its first ransom note. Bonnie was an alcoholic and Carl wasn't far behind, and their ransom notes and negotiations were chaotic at best. The terms of the first note were relatively clear, but it was sent to the wrong address. When the Greenlease family eventually received it, the letter demanded $600,000, an astronomical sum that would come to be one of the largest ransom payments in American history up to that time. The kidnappers warned the Greenleases that they were being watched, and any deviation from the instructions would result in Bobby's death. Taking no chances, the Greenleases placed an ad in the Kansas City Star newspaper, as directed in the note. The ad signaled their compliance with the ransom. Robert Greenlease Sr., alongside a small, trusted group of associates, began gathering the money. The team included Arthur Eisenhower, a prominent Kansas City bank executive and the brother of President Dwight Eisenhower. And even though the family had agreed to the ransom and were working to deliver the money, the kidnappers continued to send letters and make phone calls. Over the course of 15 calls and 6 rambling notes, the kidnappers sent contradictory instructions, which were apparently intended to play mind games and confuse the investigation. They certainly succeeded in the confusion, though it's unlikely that the confusion was the result of a grand, coherent strategy. The kidnappers struggled to manage the chaos they had created, and Bobby's parents became more frantic. Bobby's family clung to hope each time they requested proof of life. They asked the kidnappers questions to which only Bobby would know the answers. Robert Sr.'s business associates managed most of the calls, but finally Virginia Greenlease, Bobby's mother, spoke to the kidnappers herself. She asked for the name of the family's driver during their European vacation and to describe what Bobby was doing in the living room the night before his abduction. The kidnappers evaded each question. They offered vague excuses like Bobby was being annoying, or he wasn't cooperating, or he was homesick. They sent Bobby's prized Jerusalem medal as evidence that they had him, but they refused to allow Bobby to talk to his family. The vague responses tore at the family's resolve even as they tried to maintain hope. But they had to keep moving forward. On October 5th, 1 week after the abduction, 2 of Robert Sr.'s associates, Robert Letterman and Norbert O'Neill, prepared to make the most expensive ransom drop in American history. The instructions were painfully confusing as Carl Hall tried to explain them over the phone. He had been drinking heavily, and he slurred his words so badly that the Greenlease team was forced to piece together the plan during a torturous conversation, and then hope for the best. Letterman and O'Neill delivered a canvas bag full of money to the appointed spot in the middle of a rainy night, and then everyone sat by the phone and waited for news of Bobby's release. For hours, the phone remained silent. Then, Carl drunkenly called to declare he couldn't find the money. Frustration exploded. Letterman and O'Neill retraced their steps to the spot where they had left the canvas bag. Thankfully, they found the bag exactly where they had left it. It was now crystal clear that Carl himself was the problem, and Letterman voiced his irritation. Carl slurred his way through one last attempt to provide clear instructions. And something in the tension must have cut through the fog of booze. Carl recognized his own precarious position, and he promised the second drop would go perfectly. At 1 a.m., Carl sent word that he had successfully received the money, and Bobby Greenlease would be released in 24 hours. But only one of those things was true. The Greenlease family endured the next 24 hours with no word from the kidnappers and no hint of Bobby's location. While the FBI prepared for the long, tedious process of tracking the ransom money to find the kidnappers, it took Carl just 48 hours to sabotage himself. Later in the morning of October 5th, after collecting the $600,000, Carl purchased 2 silver suitcases. He split the money and put half in one suitcase and half in the other. He planned to carry one with him and bury the other. By that time, he viewed Bonnie as more of a liability than an ally. He had rented an apartment in Kansas City. When Bonnie got drunk and passed out in the apartment, he left her there with $2,000 and a hastily scribbled note promising he'd call soon. But he didn't. He grabbed the suitcases full of money and hailed a cab. The cab driver was ex-convict John Hager. Carl introduced himself as Steve Strand and handed Hager a $20 tip right off the bat. That would be like giving the driver $240 today, and the money immediately won Hager's loyalty. Carl said he wanted to go downtown to find a prostitute. Hager had experience with that kind of request, and he drove Carl straight to a woman named Sandy O'Day. As Hager then drove Carl and Sandy to a motel, Carl demanded they make a pit stop at a bar. Hager took them to a pub, and the 3 of them went inside to enjoy a drink. Carl spent money lavishly, and he overshared details of his criminal past. While he didn't mention the kidnapping, he revealed enough to intrigue Hager and O'Day. In Carl's arrogance, he'd made himself a target. Hager and O'Day now viewed Carl as a walking jackpot. Hager drove them all to a notorious spot called the Coral Court Motel. Carl gave O'Day $200 for her, quote, services, which would be more than $2,400 today. He gave Hager the equivalent of $30,000 in today's money to go run a bunch of errands, which included a shopping spree for new clothes. That night, Carl made his gravest misstep. He drank himself into a stupor, and when he was either too drunk to notice or completely passed out, Sandy O'Day looked inside one of the silver suitcases. What she found confirmed her growing suspicions. The next morning, Carl flashed $1,000 at Sandy and asked her to accompany him on a flight to Los Angeles to mail a letter to his lawyer. He believed the LA postmark would create a false trail if the authorities were on his heels. Sandy accepted the money, but quickly devised her own exit strategy. John Hager was back outside with his taxi, waiting to chauffeur Carl around town for another batch of errands. Sandy hustled outside and told John about the money in the suitcase. She claimed it had to be close to $1 million. When Carl walked outside and slid into the taxi, John Hager played it cool, but he scrutinized Carl's every move. Hager drove Carl to buy more clothes, and then garbage cans, and then shovels. And Carl insisted on stopping at bars between every purchase. Carl intended to bury some of the money as he had originally planned, but he never did it. He did become suspicious of everyone at the motel, and he left John Hager and Sandy O'Day behind, and he moved across the state to a hotel in St. Louis. By that time, John Hager was equally suspicious of Carl Hall. Carl's criminal past, his strange behavior, and his suitcases full of money convinced Hager that Carl was involved in something that Hager wanted no part of. So Hager called his boss, Joe Costello, at the Ace Cab Company. Costello was a former mobster with useful connections, and he alerted Lieutenant Louis Shoulders of the St. Louis Police Department to the situation with Carl Hall. It was not a good Samaritan call on Costello's part. Lieutenant Shoulders was well known for his crooked dealings. He had no problem shaking down robbers or other criminals and taking some of their money. So, when he and Officer Eller Dolan arrived at the Townhouse Hotel, they did exactly what they usually did. Carl had 2 metal suitcases full of nearly $600,000 when Shoulders and Dolan arrested him. But when Carl arrived at the police station, the officers only submitted 1 suitcase as evidence. At that point, technically, no one knew if Carl Hall had committed a crime, and if so, no one knew what it was. Based on the money, the officers began the interrogation with the idea that Carl was a thief or an embezzler. But Carl stunned everyone by eventually confessing to participation in the Bobby Greenlease kidnapping. And it probably didn't take long for the ramifications to hit Lieutenant Shoulders and Officer Dolan. Their life-changing payday had backfired in the worst way. They had stolen $300,000, which was being tracked by the FBI. And still, nobody knew what had happened to Bobby Greenlease. Carl wasted no time giving up Bonnie. He sent FBI agents to the rented apartment where they arrested her while she was groggy and still visibly intoxicated. Bonnie claimed she was aware of the kidnapping, but that the details were foggy. Conveniently blaming her alcoholism, she insisted she rarely knew what day it was, which made it hard to provide any clear answers. It had only been 2 days since the ransom drop, so Bobby's parents clung to the hope that Bobby was still stashed somewhere. But the brutal details of the truth slowly revealed themselves during 2 FBI interrogations. Bobby Greenlease had been murdered within hours of his abduction. That was always Carl's plan. Carl viewed Bobby as evidence which needed to be discarded. While the Greenleases were in Europe over the summer, Carl spent weeks preparing. He did his research and learned how to dispose of a body. He purchased lime, believing it would mask the smell of decomposition. He bought rope and a large plastic bag, and Bonnie helped him dig a grave in the backyard of her Missouri farmhouse. On the day of the kidnapping, Bonnie successfully took Bobby from his school. The nun who talked to Bonnie, Sister Morin, remembered the smell of Clarette's gum, which Bonnie was likely chewing to hide the smell of alcohol on her breath. Bonnie and Bobby left the school in a taxi and then transferred to Carl's station wagon. Carl drove them to a remote farm in Overland Park, Kansas, where the next part of the tragedy unfolded. At the farm in Kansas, Bonnie stepped out of the car with Carl's dog and started to take the animal for a walk. In the car, Carl tried to strangle Bobby with the rope, but it was too short. Bobby squirmed and resisted. Carl punched the boy and knocked out a few of his teeth. Then, at point-blank range, Carl shot Bobby in the head with a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. After killing Bobby, Carl, Bonnie, and the dog started the drive back over the state line to Missouri. Along the way, they made a disturbing pit stop. They left Bobby's body, still bleeding, in the back seat along with Bonnie's dog, and went into a bar to start getting seriously drunk. When they finally arrived at Bonnie's farmhouse, the couple buried Bobby in the pre-dug grave and covered his body with lime to mask the smell. Lastly, they planted flowers over the mound of dirt to disguise the grave as a garden. The story was horrifying, and the investigators quickly reevaluated evidence they already had and moved to find new evidence to support the claims of Bonnie and Carl. Carl had the .38 caliber revolver in his possession when he was arrested, and now it sounded like a murder weapon. On the morning of October 7, 1953, 9 days after the kidnapping, the FBI unearthed Bobby Greenlease. His identity was confirmed through dental records by 1 p.m. After that, justice moved swiftly. 3 weeks later, on October 30th, Carl and Bonnie were indicted on charges of kidnapping and murder. During their interrogations, they had confessed to the kidnapping, but both tried to deflect responsibility for the murder. Bonnie had helped dig a hole on her farm, but she claimed she had no idea that it was meant to be a grave, and that Carl intended to kill Bobby Greenlease. Carl made up a bizarre story about a guy named Tom Marsh, whom Carl claimed committed the murder. FBI agents were skeptical, but they pursued the lead anyway. It led nowhere. Realizing the game was up, Carl admitted that Tom Marsh didn't exist, and he confessed to the kidnapping and murder. Bonnie followed suit. She admitted her role, but continued to deny any advanced knowledge of Carl's intentions. Both pleaded guilty. Given the overwhelming evidence, including Bonnie's 25-page confession and Carl's 36-page confession, the legal proceedings were brief. Carl and Bonnie received the death penalty, and Judge Albert Reeves described the situation as the most cold-blooded, brutal murder case he had ever handled. Execution was scheduled for December 18, 1953. Bonnie, showing no remorse in court, later wrote an apology letter to the Greenlease family. Her words, tinged with desperation and self-pity, offered no solace. "I doubt if this letter will do much good, but there isn't anything we could do or say that would atone for our mistake. I would give anything if I could go back to that Sunday in September and erase everything that has happened since. It all seems like a nightmare to me. I don't say I don't enjoy money, as everybody does, but that was not my motive. My case was loving, not wisely, but too well. I wanted so much for him to be happy. I think anyone will find, if you drink from 1 to 2/5 of whiskey a day for a year and a half, that your brain doesn't function properly. Since I have been in jail, is the first time I've been able to reason clearly for some time." At 12 minutes past midnight on December 18, 1953, Carl and Bonnie were executed in the gas chamber at the state penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri. They received the ultimate punishment, but they weren't the only ones who were punished. Allegations emerged that a significant portion of the ransom money had disappeared. But in Carl's final interviews, he insisted that he had all the money with him at the time of his arrest. By the spring of 1954, Lieutenant Louis Shoulders and arresting officer Eller Dolan faced charges of perjury in connection to the missing funds. Shoulders was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Dolan received 2 years. But despite the convictions, more than half of the ransom money, over $300,000, has never been recovered. Next time on Infamous America, it's the story of the man who is considered one of America's earliest serial killers. He's a con man and a murderer. He's the arch fiend and the devil in the White City. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett, but he's better known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, the man who built the so-called murder castle in Chicago before the 1892 World's Fair. The story of H.H. Holmes begins next time on Infamous America. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program don't have to wait week to week to receive new episodes. They receive the entire season to binge all at once with no commercials, and they also receive exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. This episode was researched and written by Mandy Wimmer. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm Chris Wimmer. Thanks for listening.